It's my pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote, Noreen Olson. Born and raised on a farm west of Ponoka, Noreen is a farm wife, mother, and grandmother who lives near Cremona, Alberta. After graduating from high school, Noreen joined the ATB, and while there she met and married Ralph Olson. Just before their first anniversary, they moved to Ralph's farm, where they now live and stay today. For 25 years, Noreen wrote a bi-weekly column for the Didsbury Review. The column was primarily humor, but there was also nostalgia, warmth, human interest, social comment, family, birds, animals, love for the country, and rural living. Noreen's columns have been collected into a series of books and several columns and have been aired on CBC Radio. Her latest book, The School Bus Doesn't Stop There Anymore, has been sold to audiobooks. And for those who don't have audiobooks driving down the highways of Alberta, they are the best things going. So it's be well worth investing in it. Noreen is a longtime member of Alberta Women's Institutes and Sons of Norway. She teaches communications classes, is past chair of the Alberta Rural Childcare Pilot Project, and is a marriage commissioner. So if there's anybody looking today, Noreen has 3 children and 3 grandchildren and is a proud supporter of all things rural. Please join me in welcoming Noreen Olson.
Thank you, Brad, for the lovely introduction. And Ralph and I would like to thank you, the organizers, for the super breakfast as well. I'm delighted to be here because rural education is close to my heart and a big part of my history. My school was Ferrybank, and in 1902, my grandfather Johnston had helped to build it. My dad, who was born in 1901, started school there in about 1907. And Dad's birth certificate lists his place of birth as Ferrybank, Northwest Territories. My siblings and I attended Ferrybank in the 30s and 40s and until the school closed in 1951. In 1952, the school came under the county and the students were bused into Ponoka. It was no picnic. It was about 75 miles a day on gravel roads. Our children all had grades 1 to 12 in Cremona, and now we have a grandson, Max, who's in school in Cremona. So this covers 5 generations of involvement in country schools. And if I'm not an expert in the field, I at least have some familiarity with the system. Ferrybank, the name, had nothing to do with ferries at the bottom of the garden. Its name is from a store and ferry that operated on the Battle River. There was no river and no ferry anywhere near the school. But it was Ferrybank District, so it was Ferrybank School. When the school was approved in 1901, it formed school district number 630, and it was about 7 miles west and 5 north of Ponoka. By 1937, the school was much too small and had to be enlarged. There were now 39 students, and it was so crowded that desks had to be moved in order to open the door. Just imagine how embarrassing this would be if you were late, and supposing there had been a fire and the nasty little oily floor and the great big furnace. The wood-fired heater took up a good part of the schoolroom, and the people furthest from it got chilblains while the kids closest nearly cooked. At that time, the school stood east and west, and when they enlarged it, they cut the school in half, lifted it with jacks and beams, poured a cement basement, added 10 feet down the center, and turned it north and south. They also put in a furnace in the basement, and my brother did the janitor work there for several years, and he said that the cement was so poor that when the kids played down there, the dust was so thick that you couldn't see across the room. The toilets, of course, were 2 small buildings in the far corners of the schoolyard. And there was a barn for our school ponies, and it was usually full. There was a pump that served the school, and if you really wanted to, you could water your horse, but fooling around with horses during school hours was discouraged. There was a low spot in the yard, and during spring thaw or a good summer rain, a pretty good pool would form out there. And then, of course, everyone wanted to water their pony, and water and kids and horses usually meant wet clothes and mud, and somebody falling in and get soaked. But most of us went barefoot, so just getting your feet wet wasn't considered a problem. Ronnie was paid $5 a month for janitor work, and that included coming early to light the furnace. In 34-35, the teacher, Miss McGuire, was paid $600. By 37-38, she was making $750 and teaching grades 1 to 9 for a total of 39 kids. And remember, this was a yearly wage, not a monthly wage. And Miss McGuire was a jewel. The kids adored her. She was a good teacher. She played the piano and sang. And somehow the school raised enough money to buy a piano, and the big girls kept it shining. When Miss McGuire quit teaching, she obligingly married the nice Norwegian farmer across the road, and then after she continued to play the piano for the odd music class and always for the Christmas concert until the school closed. In 1940, Miss Binion was the teacher, and her father built a little teacherage on the school grounds, and when Bill Bloor came there in 1943, he added another 2 rooms to accommodate his family of 4. And during the 4 years that he taught at Ferrybank, we got a rink, an ice slide, indoor chemical toilets, a landscaped yard, and access to the university library system. Now this meant that we could choose books from a list, and Mr. Bloor would order them from Edmonton, and this was absolutely wonderful. We had a school library. It was like 3 shelves 3 feet wide. And I had read everything in the school library by the time I was 8. Our playground equipment consisted of 1 swing, 1 teeter-totter, a bat, and a ball. There was no budget for anything beyond pencils, paper, chalk, and textbooks. Supplies were carefully monitored, and you didn't get a new pencil on a whim. Colored chalk was kept in the teacher's desk and only used for very special occasions. Wood for the furnace was donated. We all drank from a common dipper that hung in a pail of water, and we all washed in the same enamel wash basin. Occasionally, they'd try to set up some kind of a system for family towels, but it never worked. The school had fundraisers for things like Christmas treats and Halloween parties, and I can remember box, pie, shadow, shoe socials, and bazaars. And of course, there were lots of fundraisers too. There were bridal showers, dances, vacation Bible school, church, Sunday school, polling booth, card parties, political rallies, women's institutes, health care, and Red Cross. The school picnic and the Christmas concert were the most important events of the year. The school picnic was the opportunity for all the moms to show off their cooking, and for the community to meet the new babies and the newest neighbors. There was homemade ice cream at the picnic, and if you don't think that was huge. There was also enough chocolate cake, pie, and jello to put the entire community into diabetic shock. There were prizes to be won at the picnic: egg and spoon, 3-legged, sack, necktie race. The Christmas concert was magic, and a teacher's reputation was made or broken by the quality of the Christmas concert. Highlight of the year. Excitement bordering on hysteria, preparations began right after Halloween. Once a year opportunity to let your imagination soar as you became a society matron, or a spinster aunt, or housekeeper to bachelor ranchers, or maybe even a murder victim. There were recitations and songs tailored to the child's age and ability, and military drills and tableaus. There was an enormous tree, a raised stage, which was just planks over some blocks of wood, a curtain which had been somebody's old bedspread, carols and costumes and Santa Claus. Every kid got a bag from Santa Claus. There was a mandarin orange, some hard candies, and some nuts. And there was always a little gift from the teacher and something from the kid who had drawn your name. One year, Vernon Santee gave me a bottle of Evening in Paris perfume. Pretty sophisticated for a 10-year-old. And then there was the manger scene. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who had very long, dark blonde hair. The little girl wore her hair in pigtails 364 days of the year, but on the day of the annual Christmas concert, her mother bound it into tiny, nasty metal curlers. Later, amid much screaming and weeping, it was combed into very long, tight ringlets. Because of these painful, though spectacular ringlets, and because the little girl's older sister owned a red velvet housecoat, the little girl got to be Mary in the nativity scene year after year. The nativity scene was the highlight of the school Christmas concert. A cradle was stage front, and the biggest baby doll in the neighborhood lay in the cradle. A flashlight propped against the doll's stomach shone on a huge gold star suspended from the ceiling. Mary sat behind the cradle. Joseph, in his father's bathrobe, stood just behind her left shoulder. A few shepherds lurked in the shadows in the back of the stage. They wore long coats and carried homemade crooks. Between the shepherds and the little family were 3 kids dressed in baggy pants and bright shirts. They wore assorted crowns, carried packages on their upturned palms, and were, of course, the 3 kings of Orient. Everyone who was not on stage was in the heavenly chorus. The members of the chorus sang appropriate carols and were vital to the tableau. They were naturally unseen. In the heavenly chorus, there was a little girl whose hair was brown, straight, and short. Her name was Verna. When, for the 3rd consecutive year, the ringleted child was chosen to be Mary, little Verna gritted her teeth and made a vow. From then on, she refused haircuts, and as Christmas came upon them the next year, Verna's hair had indeed grown, but sad to say, it was still about 2 feet shorter than the perennial Mary. Nonetheless, Verna was hopeful, especially since it was now only a week to the concert and the teacher was still busily rehearsing plays, drills, and recitations. The whole school had to practice with the heavenly chorus, and nothing had been said about who would pose in the manger scene. Verna and I stood side by side on stage. "I'm going to be Mary this year," Verna said. "You are?" I questioned her. "Did Mr. Bloor say so?" "No," she replied airily, "but you see how long my hair is?" "Long?" I said, genuinely surprised. "You call that long? My baby sister's hair is longer than that, and she's only 2 years old." Verna pushed me off the stage. I flew through the air and my forehead struck a desktop. The teacher picked me up, took me outside, and packed snow on my eye. "You're going to have the granddaddy of black eyes," he told me, and I began to wail. "I can't be Mary with a black eye, and I have to have those rotten ringlets for nothing." "You can still be Mary," he soothed. "We will keep the lights very low." The manger scene was lovely as usual. Hardly anyone noticed that one of Mary's downcast eyes was purple. My beloved Mr. Bloor moved at the end of June, and the next teacher didn't do a manger scene. Poor Verna never did get to be Mary. I wish she had. I might even have loaned her my sister's red velvet housecoat. Horses were a big part of the country school. I started at 5, riding behind my brother Ronnie on a horse called Kaiser Bill. The next year I rode off alone on Darksy. Darksy was old and gentle and pokey, and he pretty well did what he pleased while I just went along for the ride. I was late a lot. He liked to run around corners. There were 3 corners on the way to school, and for a while there I fell off 3 times, coming and going. He always stopped to eat grass and wait for me to catch up. I progressed to Spring, who was mule-headed but sturdy and dependable, and then Pal, who would not let any horse get ahead of him, so he ran away repeatedly, and then Flicka, who was lovely. She was a blue roan with a silver mane and tail. And in those days, every other little girl in the English-speaking world named her horse Flicka. The ride to and from school was an important part of the day. Part of my route was through an undeveloped road allowance that was truly, truly lovely. It was just a trail, really. A horse and wagon could go through, but certainly not a car. Willow and dwarf birch grew right down to the trail's edge. Giant aspens met overhead. In summer, little streams crossed the road, and during spring break, we waded through rushing creeks. There were lots of birds, and wild roses, and saskatoons, and buttercups, and chokecherries, lady slippers, and bluebells. I can smell that road. It was cool and fresh and woodsy. We were always stopping to pick flowers for Mama, and I was late a lot. Our farm has 2 nice little creeks, so even though our kids do not get to paddle in creeks on the way to school, they have access to lots of running water at home. The little wild road drifted in winter, and we had to go around, which was a challenge, because there were other kids on the alternate road, and as Pal would not allow any horse to get ahead of him, we had some pretty wild rides. We rode bareback because Dad said that kids got killed by being hung up in a stirrup and dragged, so with no saddle, getting back on your horse wasn't that easy. Usually we climbed on a fence. When I was about 6, I climbed on a fence while carrying a handful of buttercups. A staple came loose, and a barb cut into my ankle and instep so badly that by the time I got home, my running shoe was full of blood. I still have the scars. Our main recreation was softball, and thousands of games were played in the schoolyard. I had started school at 5 and took grades 2 and 3 in 1 year, so I was at least 3 years younger than my contemporaries and totally non-athletic. I was always chosen last. The better players formed a team and challenged any other schools that were within our traveling area. Competition was fierce, and the ultimate insult to our players was to be called the little fairies from the bank. We also played dodgeball and anti-over. Our barn was perfect for this, long, low, and with a simple gable roof. We played hopscotch, red light, hide and seek, pum-pum, pull away, Simon Says, hockey, skating, crack the whip. I hated and feared crack the whip, but to refuse was to be branded as sissy, and so you took your turn at the end of the whip, fully expecting to die. I hated most sports because you had to compete at your grade level, and I was always the dumb baby. Last kid in the 50-yard dash. My fault that we lost the relay race. First got in dare base. I still hate organized sport. And when conversation turns to football or hockey, my brain shuts off. Defense mechanism I learned at 7. Grades 1, 2, and 3 were Division 1. Grades 4, 5, and 6 were Division 2. Grades 7, 8, 9 were Division 3. It was written in stone somewhere, in Edmonton we assumed, that when you were in Division 2 you had to do some handicraft to be sold at the bazaar. I was 7 in grade 4, and about as coordinated as any 7-year-old, I guess. Someone had given Mom a cushion cover with a great big grim helmeted soldier holding a rifle and a bayonet and lurching through a big V for victory. "Carry on, Canada," it said across the banner in the bottom, and there were maple leaves and roses and shamrocks and a thistle. Now, can you imagine giving this to your 7-year-old? Isn't that a lovely project for a 7-year-old? The Verrere girls were crocheting tablecloths. If they'd been spinning straw into gold, I wouldn't have been a bit more impressed. On home ec days, I'd be too ill to eat my lunch, knowing that I could not, no matter how I tried, embroider 3 consecutive matching stitches on my wretched cushion cover. I poked myself a lot, bled a little, and cried into my pony's mane on the way home. I also hated and feared art. Art seemed mostly forming ornate letters and numbers on a 9 by 12 page, and then framing the whole thing in an India ink border. I could never put an India ink border on my project without digging holes in the paper, spilling the ink. Favorite trick was to have one finger sitting over the edge of the ruler as you drew the line, and then you'd have this fine, big, irreparable lump on your India ink border. I also hated penmanship, accuracy drills, vitamin pills, winter footwear, felt socks, long stockings, and oh, I hated current events. How were we supposed to be able to be up on current events? No daily paper, no TV, no Maclean's magazine, CBC radio, just a battery-powered radio dying softly in the final moments of Lux Radio Theater. And what normal kid would sacrifice the Shadow or the Green Hornet or Inner Sanctum to save the battery for the stupid news? I was absolutely delighted when Mount Vesuvius erupted because it went on for days and days and I could use the same thing over and over and over. Mr. Bloor had pictures of federal and provincial representatives lining the walls above the blackboard, and we were sometimes drilled as to who was who. William Aberhart was both Premier and Education Minister, so it was a bonus if you got William Aberhart. I loved all the subjects concerned with literature, reading, and English. I even liked spelling lists because you were required to write a sentence with each word, and I'd make my sentences into a story. I loved composition and free reading and memory work. Do they do memory work at all anymore? Do they do memory work at all? That's too bad, because memory work is good for your brain, and it teaches you to appreciate the rhythm and flow of the English language. On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the wold and meet the sky, and through the fields the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow, round an island there below, the island of Shalott. Or, the wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees, the moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas, the road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwayman came riding, 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 and the highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. The Ballad of East and West had everything: beautiful language, adventure, courage, loyalty, honor, and horses. Oh, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. Then there is neither east nor west, border nor breed nor birth, till two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. Kamal is out with 20 men to raise the border side, and he has lifted the colonel's mare that is the colonel's pride. He has lifted her out of the stable door between the dawn and the day, and turned the calkins upon her feet and ridden her far away. Not everyone loved memory work. I can remember my brother Ronnie saying of a classmate, "We had memory work today and Gordy couldn't remember the name of the piece." The best teachers read to us on Friday afternoons after last recess. Mr. Bloor read Ivanhoe and Ben-Hur. And for a while there, you heard some pretty strange language on the playground. Gird thy loins, thou Saxon swine. Stand forth, cowardly varlet. He also read Great Expectations, Lorna Doone, a little Shakespeare even. My brother Howie and I used to do Pyramus and Thisbe's death scene, or, well, parts of it anyway. Asleep, my love, what dead, my dove? O Pyramus, arise. We thought it was just simply hilarious. And I think it's safe to say that for some of us, this reading was our one contact with culture. Except, of course, for Miss McElvina. Anybody here old enough to remember Miss McElvina? And the school broadcasts. Miss McElvina had a very cultured accent and a falsetto voice. She told stories, taught us songs, such gems as Hinky Pinky Pie went up the water spout, and everyone with a birthday this week to the front of the class while we sing Happy Birthday to You. Miss McElveen just embarrassed us to death. One of the challenges in being a country school teacher is that inevitably you're going to have to teach your own child. There's a Peter Zosky story about the lady that was the school teacher that was wiping down the blackboard with a rag, and she paused for a moment and said, "Why, this is Jackie's old horsey pajamas." And the kid was old horsey pajamas for the rest of his days. Mr. Bloor's son, Donnie, was a very poor student. I don't mean that he wasn't bright. He seemed fine in every way, but he was a terrible student who just didn't seem to make much effort, and he drove his dad to distraction. And now he'd probably be diagnosed with a learning disability and get some assistance, but not then. One day, Mr. Bloor was trying to get Donnie to comprehend some math concept, and Donnie was steadfastly refusing to take it in. They'd been round and round and round, and you could see that the teacher was at the end of his rope when Donnie yelled, "I have to go to the bathroom." "Go then," his dad said, and he grabbed the front of Donnie's desk, pulled it out of the line, down the center of the aisle, through the boys' cloakroom, opened the door to the basement where the toilets were, and threw kid, desk, and all down the basement steps. There was a great crashing and screaming, but Donnie survived unscathed. And when we came to school the next day, Mr. Bloor had repaired the desk, and he apologized to everybody, including Donnie. After we were married, I found out that Mr. Bloor was teaching shop in Calgary, so I looked him up, and we had several lovely visits at our farm and our place, and later at the lodge where they moved. You'll be pleased to know that Donnie grew up and became a nice, useful person, and he and his dad seemed to be getting along very well. I had Mr. Bloor for grades 4, 5, 6, and 7. He moved away because one of the local families was angry because of the way that he had disciplined their spoiled kid, and because he had made several lovely big tables for student seating and used them in place of desks, and the school board didn't like this break from tradition, and because it was time to try something new. He took a course and became a jeweler for a while, and then he was a resident teacher at some Christian school in BC and taught shop in Calgary, and in retirement he was involved in something called a tape ministry. He was a very versatile and talented man who did an awful lot for our community, and by the time he left Ferrybank, I had caught up to my peers, and while I was still no athlete, I held my own on all other levels, even home ec. In grade 8, we had Mr. Bumbury, and that's not his real name. Within a few weeks, we knew that Mr. Bumbury was a disaster. He didn't seem to have any plan for the day. He was not following the curriculum. By November, we were already so far behind in math that there was no way that we would finish the textbook. And almost every other day, we had what he called a geography match. This meant that we lined up in teams, and one child began with the name of a country, and then the next child on the next team had to name the country that began with the last letter of the previous one, and so on and so on. There was a lot of countries, there's a lot of countries that begin and end with A. So Argentina, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, America, Arabia, they got used over and over and over again. He didn't ask where the countries were, or if we could find them on a map, or we just mindlessly yelled the names over and over. It was November by now, and there was no sign of a Christmas concert. We were angry and sad, disappointed and frustrated. And on some days, he would come back to class after last recess, assign free reading or tell us to write out times tables or something. And then he'd go back to the teacherage while the kids just raised hell, of course. And after a while, he'd come back to the school all happy and relaxed and dopey and smelling really weird. I was almost 12 by now, in grade 8 and president of the Students' Union. I wanted to go to high school, and I knew that the way things were going, I wouldn't pass grade 8, let alone pass the departmentals in grade 9. Well, what does a union leader do? A union leader calls a strike. During noon hour, I and some of my faithful lieutenants made a big strike poster and tacked it to the front door. Then we raided the teacher's desk for colored chalk and made posters on the blackboard. The posters said something like, "Stand up, strike. Ferrybank Students Union strikes for better teaching. We will not sit still for this any longer." When Mr. Bunbury came back after lunch, we were all standing, and when he said, "Class be seated," we stayed standing. Some of the little ones tried to sit down, but we big ones picked them up by the scruff of the neck and pulled them to their feet. He blustered a little, and then somebody yelled, "The inspector is here." Well, suddenly we were not so brave, and several of us rushed to wipe off the blackboards, but nobody got the poster off the front door. And when Mr. Ross, the inspector, walked in, the place was in utter turmoil. "You can all go and play," he said, and I watched from the boys' cloakroom while Mr. Ross made Mr. Bunbury sign his resignation. I'm quite sure that the school board had already complained, and Mr. Bunbury, our strike was undoubtedly just the last straw. However, it was a powerful moment for kids. Within a few weeks, we had a new teacher. He was a military man who really didn't like kids much. Not even his own, actually. They moved while their son was away on holidays once and didn't tell him where they'd gone. He was unimaginative and mean and rigid, but we worked, and I passed grade 8, and I did well on my departmentals the next year. Now, you remember Paul Harvey? He's the guy that used to say, "And now for the rest of the story." I was a marriage commissioner for 23 years. I loved it. That's a super job, and I keep saying that I'm going to write a book about being a marriage commissioner. One day, about 20 years ago, a man phoned and said that his son and his fiancée lived in Edmonton, but wanted to be married in Carstairs because some of the family lived there, and it was central for both families. Was I free on August the 15th? And what did they need to know in order to start preparation? Yes, I said, I had that date available, and he should tell the couple that the license good for 3 months, so pick up your marriage license sometime between, after May the 15th, get in touch with me to arrange an interview, and then we can go over the ceremony and decide about special arrangements. And that would let me get started on my paperwork, of course. Meanwhile, I'll just put Sam and Sally on my appointment book. In a few weeks, the bride phoned and we arranged a meeting. A very ordinary little couple arrived, and I showed them in and seated them at my kitchen counter. I opened the envelope and began to read the names on the marriage license, and I said, "Did your grandfather happen to be a school teacher?" "Yes," said the groom. "Do you know if he taught near Ponoka?" "I think so." "Is your grandfather still alive?" No, Grandpa's gone, but Grandma will be there, and I'll ask her if he taught near Ponoka." Well, I had just been diagnosed with diabetes, and my doctor was having trouble figuring out my medication. We were building a new house. Our daughter was in Japan teaching English. My parents were old and having health problems. I wasn't feeling really, really well, and this was about to become the wedding from hell. Civil ceremonies can be extremely nice, but they're usually simple. Did they want any special arrangements? Did they want any special arrangements? They had somehow confused the Carstairs Community Hall with St. James Cathedral, and me with Cardinal Richelieu. They wanted a rehearsal, They had 6 attendants each, the Jewish processional wherein each partner is escorted in by both parents, candle lighting by both mothers, 3 readings by assorted uncles, 2 musical interludes, personal vows followed by a sand ceremony and a receiving line. I was also expected to make a series of announcements in regard to photos, supper, cake cutting, and I'm not sure what else, parking and toilet facilities possibly. When I got to the hall, they had moved the wedding from the front of the hall up onto the stage and lit the area with half a dozen candles. I knew the ceremony pretty well, but still I'd prefer to be able to see at least which page I was on, and especially with all these additions that had to be counted in. We were late getting started because Grandma and the people who were bringing her got lost. Somehow I shepherded them through the whole miserable production, and after the final solo and the signing of the register and the announcements, the happy couple and their vanguard of attendants streamed off the stage. Now I'm collecting my papers and briefcases and purse and camera and doing a final check of the registration form when I discovered that the printed name of one of the witnesses supplied to me by the bride 3 months ago does not match the signature. Vital Statistics frowns on this kind of thing. By now, the 16 members of the bridal party have dispersed. Some have gone to the bathroom, some outside to smoke, some are having their pictures taken. With some difficulty, I found the bride in a little side room where she was having her photo taken. I waved the registration form under her nose and said, quite nicely, I thought, "Who is this person and when did you change the witnesses?" "Oh," she said, "her dress wasn't quite the same as the others, so when we changed her position in the lineup..." "Look," I said, "you get somebody to find the person whose name is printed in this space and bring her here right now, and I don't give a damn if she's naked." If ever I do get around to writing my wedding book, this chapter will be titled "The Revenge of Mr. Bunbury." I'm grateful for my years in a country school, and I'm grateful that my kids were able to go to school in Cremona, where they had mostly excellent teachers and who made every effort to nurture and encourage their talents and strengthen their weaknesses. We believe in rural education, and I think our family proves its worth. My dad was an MLA for 15 years. His brother Fay was a pharmacist, Sister Mina a teacher. In my generation, everyone has become good tax-paying Albertans. We have a few university degrees. And in the political tradition of the family, we have one MP. Our kids are Mark, his degree's in computer science, and he has his own consulting company. After several years in the business community, he's now taken over the farm. Kirsten's degree is in philosophy. She taught English in Japan for 2 years, then came home to be executive director of Legal Archives of Alberta. But when her children came, she wanted something with less hours, so she's now with Canada Parks and Wildlife. John got his master's in physics at the University of Calgary and then won a scholarship to MIT, where he got his doctorate in earth sciences. He's now with Google in Boston, where he heads a team of 12 engineers. A little early to tell what Max will be, but he won a silver in the science fair last week. Now, I still have that seemed suddenly got awfully loud. I see I still have a few minutes, so I'll read you a quick one from my children's education in rural schools. Our kids started trick-or-treating when Mark was 2 2/3 years old and John 10 1/2 months. The kids hadn't exactly begged to go. Mark didn't really know what Halloween was, and John wasn't talking much, so the truth is, they went for my pleasure. I hadn't thought of taking them till the last minute, so their costumes suffered from spontaneity, but we took them to the homes of 3 or 4 dear friends, and the cherubic shepherd and tottery devil, no one walks well at 10 1/2 months, were received with delight. The next year I started planning earlier. Mark was a knight in armor. He wore a shirt of chainmail, plumed bleach bottle helmet, and tights made from the good parts of 2 old Teflon ironing board covers. John, his faithful squire, wore a green jerkin over a red sweater and tights. His belt was a rope, and he carried Mark's extra sword. A year later, when Kirsten was 11 months old, they were all green caterpillars with big black velvet spots and silver eyes and antennae. On succeeding Halloweens, we had robots, ghosts, mummies, chickens, hillbillies, hobos, and monsters. I loved Halloween, and fortunately, the kids were good sports about it. Up to a point, that is. As Kirsten's grade 2 Halloween party approached, I suggested possible costumes, and finally she agreed to be a ghost. We assembled a sheet, a derby hat, a neck chain, and some blue rubber gloves, and on the day of the party, I handed her a bag containing these items. "I don't want a costume," she said. "Honey," I told her, "this is the day of the party. Everyone will have a costume." "I don't want a costume." "Look, Kirsten," I said, "you agreed on the ghost, but I guess if I can find John's old mummy costume, or maybe the robot thing." "I don't want a costume." 2 minutes to bus time was never my most rational period, so I let her go. But as lunchtime, party time approached, I became more and more concerned. Finally, I snatched up the bag, jumped in the car, and drove to Cremona. I had Kirsten sent out into the hall, and we conferred. "Sweetheart," I whispered, "I was afraid you'd be wishing you had a costume, so I bought the—" She interrupted me. "I don't want a costume." "Why don't you want a costume?" "I just don't want one." "Look, kid, for my sake, wear this costume. You don't want to be the only child in there in civvies. People will think you have a rotten mother." "I'm not the only one. Cora Sue is in plain clothes." "Cora Sue? Isn't she the little girl who couldn't finish her popsicle stick bread basket because her mother fell asleep on the table? Put on the lousy costume." I had inadvertently raised my voice during this exchange, and I'm afraid I had also gripped my daughter's shoulder with something more than motherly affection. She began to look tearful. She shrank away from my hand and glanced apprehensively toward her classroom door. A new teacher whom I did not recognize walked past us. She raised her eyebrows knowingly. Now I was not only a rotten mother who couldn't be bothered to costume her child, I was also suspected of child abuse. It was time to give up. There's no logic in forcing a child to have fun. I patted Kirsten's head and turned away in defeat, just as Joyce Pawson came down the hall carrying a plate of fudge for the party. "And what is Wade dressed as?" I asked. I was hoping that she would say, "Oh, nothing, he didn't want a costume." But no such luck. Wade was a leopard, complete with whiskers and tail. "This is such an exciting time for the kids," Joyce said. "They get such a kick out of the party and their costumes, but you know, there's always 1 or 2 poor little guys with no costumes at all. Such a shame. Some mothers just don't seem to care." I very much enjoyed being with you this morning. I wish you every success in this symposium and in all your future endeavors. I brought along some of my books, which I'd love to sign for you, and Mother's Day is coming up, and Mom and Dad would love them. Grandma and Grandpa too, actually. If you have any questions, I will certainly try to answer them, depending upon the subject, of course. No? We have, okay.
Thank you. I've always wondered, because I've heard about the normal school, teacher school maybe, but everywhere I turn, I keep hearing about normal school. And I'm wondering where that comes from, because there seems to be more than one school called that.
Ralph's sister went to normal school because it was wartime, and they just went long enough to be accredited, and then after, years later, she went back and got her master's through summer schools. I know that, actually, but it slips my mind at the moment. I've read why that's called normal school. It had something to do with that they learned the normal curriculum. It wasn't because it was expected to turn all girls or all teachers into normal people. And while I was reading East is East and West is West, which is Kipling, of course. Oh, spoiled my punchline there. We belong to Sons of Norway, and we're allowed to tell dumb Norwegian jokes. And you know, about Thorvald had finally gotten up enough courage to go and call on Dina. He took a little gift with him, and he said, as he handed her the book of poetry, he said, "I hope you like Kipling." She said, "Well, I really don't know. I have never kippled." Anything further?
The normal school is named after Dewey's School in the town of Normal Bloomington in Illinois, where the first pragmatist school was developed.
Thank you.